South Korea authorities released the prelim report on the tragic JeJu Airlines crash in Muan. Let's go over it in this episode of Taking Off. Hi, I'm Dan Milliken. We had just released a video on the JeJu crash, and then 2 days later, South Korean authorities have released the prelim report. So let's update what we know and what we can learn. JeJu Airlines was the 737-800 series that crashed at Muan International Airport on December 29, 2024, after hitting birds on final approach. They did a go-around and then landed the opposite direction and crashed into a concrete reinforced berm, killing all but 2 of the 181 passengers and crew. The South Korean agency in charge of the investigation is the Aviation and Railway Accident Investigation Board, or ARAIB. So let's get into their preliminary report. Okay, as we look at this, date and time was 9:03 a.m. local on December 29, 2024. The Boeing 737-800, registration HL8088, operating as flight number 7C2216, was flying from Bangkok to Muan International. The airplane was destroyed and 179 people perished. 2 survived with serious injuries. After departing Bangkok and flying over Taiwan, the majority of the flight was uneventful. At 8:54 and 43 seconds, the plane first talked to tower, which cleared them to land runway 01. Winds were 110 at 2 knots, which basically calm. 3 minutes after clearing them to land, the tower warned of bird activity at 8:57 and 50 seconds. Both cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder stopped recording exactly 60 seconds later. Several times in this report, the language is, during a go-around, they had a bird strike. This is saying that the plane initiated a go-around before the bird strike. And if accurate, it's very important. If the plane was on short final and had the bird strike, the safest plan would be to keep landing, to land at that runway that's just ahead of you. But if they saw a large flock of ducks ahead of them and called a go-around to try and miss them, then there would be at least that reason for the go-around. Regardless, 6 seconds after the end of the CVR, the plane called a mayday and flew over the left side of runway 01. Then they turned right and approached runway 19, the opposite direction runway, aligned with the center line and belly landed. They overran the runway and crashed into the embankment at 9:02, 57 seconds. We'll circle back to this in a minute to go over some crucial data. The report continues that the 737 was first delivered to Ryanair in 2009 and was leased to JeJu Air early 2017. The report includes pictures of the accident scene. The engines buried into the embankment while the fuselage flipped over and burned beyond the embankment. The black boxes containing the CVR and FDR were recovered but were missing the final 4 minutes and 7 seconds. The report mentions at the time that the black boxes stopped, the plane was at 161 knots and 498 feet. Again, we'll circle around to this as it's crucial, and you'll see why. The flight crew, which we reported in our last video, the captain had 6,823 hours and the first officer had 1,650 hours, 1,339 of which were in the 737. You wouldn't see this in the U.S. as pilots of airliners by the FAA standards generally have to have 1,500 hours to be hired, generally. There's exceptions and all that kind of stuff, but 1,300 hours in a 737 out of your first 1,600 would be highly unlikely in the U.S. What this means is that the first officer received some initial training and then went right into the right seat of the 737. But talking to 737 pilots, it's actually a lot of time. And even in my own plane, my Cessna 210, 1,300 hours is a ton of time. The report mentions the weather, with the wind being almost calm, as I mentioned earlier, and visibility was very clear. Few clouds at 4,500 feet, so it wasn't about the weather. Weather was great. Then we get to the bird strike. The report states that the pilots identified a group of birds while approaching runway 01, and that would then explain why they might choose to go around at that moment. And when they released the existing CVR and FDR information, that will be made clear. The report confirms a security camera filmed the plane coming close to a group of birds, again, quote, during a go-around. Both engines had bird feathers and bloodstains. The report mentions the Baikal teals, a type of duck common in Asia. The report ends with what the agency's plans are and who is assisting, namely the U.S. NTSB and the French version as well. Okay, that was the prelim report, and some data that we also have gives some details in conjunction with that. The ADS-B, which also stopped 8:58:50, the same second as the CVR and FDR stoppage, shows the descent to just under 500 feet here, with the plane in a 600 to 700 feet a minute descent. Then at this point, the airplane has a 1,700 feet a minute climb for just a moment and climbs to just over 600 feet, so it just gains 100 feet, and then back to 600 feet a minute descent. A momentary rapid climb, then back to descending. Then the data stops. In a go-around, there's a toga button, a takeoff go-around, that when a go-around is called for on the 737-800, there's actually two presses of the button. The first time, the engines go to 80%. The second press would be 100%. With the airplane in this case on a stable approach, 600 or 700 feet a minute descent rate, 161 knots, the engines on the 737 are around 60 to 70% depending on the flap setting, which at this point is probably flaps 30 or flaps 40. Talking to 737 pilots, the toga button is pretty quick. You're only going from 60 to 70% to 80%. When the go-around is called, it's immediately hitting the button and getting more engine power, then flaps 15 from flaps 30 or 40, and then when you have a positive rate of climb, the gear comes up. Then, when able, you bring the rest of the flaps up. This procedure is critical to follow and hardcore drilled because, for instance, pulling up flaps too soon can raise the possibility of stalling. But the go-around is a procedure that is heavily trained. Also, not in the report, but we have confirmed the gear was down as they were on final approach to runway 01. Here is a picture of the plane shortly before the go-around on final. Now, it's been reported that the plane had a complete electrical failure, which is why the CVR and FDR stopped. But again, talking to 737 pilots, the batteries can run an entire Cat 3 landing and should last 20, 30, even 40 minutes. And we know after the bird strike, the radios were working, so they did have electrical power for that. And I have no doubt that the NTSB assisting in this will be able to back engineer this to figure out the answers. For the electrical power coming off the engines, when you look at an engine, you have that first fan. You see it when the airplane's parked at the gate. That fan is the N1 fan, and it freely turns. While waiting at that gate, you might see the wind blowing it, and it moves. Beyond that one is the second fan, the N2 fan, and that one is geared, and the electrical power is generated off those gears. One possibility is that large birds decimated the N1 fan and then damaged the N2 geared accessories, knocking out the power, while the engine is still able to maybe generate some thrust. It's remote, but it's a possibility. And then it's also possible that that happened to both engines at the same time. And lastly, we have data that the plane impacted the embankment at 160 knots. The last FDR had them at 160 knots and 498 feet. And after a belly landing and slide for half the runway and the 600 feet of overrun, they impacted at 160 knots. What this means is that it would be impossible to lose both engines totally at 500 feet, fly past the runway, turn around tightly, and land faster than you started. It's just not physically possible without thrust. The plane had to at least have partial power in one or both engines. And with partial power coming from the engines, I'm sure investigators will look at why the CVR and FDR stopped. You still have some power. Was it possible but unlikely event of the bird damage affecting the N2 geared fan in both engines? Hopefully we'll be able to find out. 737 pilots I talked to mentioned that 4 minutes is an eternity. The APU only takes 60 to 90 seconds to be up and running after starting it, and the captain had a lot of time in type. It would be totally understandable to call for the go-around before hitting the birds, and investigators will be looking to see if the landing gear was unable to be deployed or if it was a pilot choice or even an oversight in the midst of an emergency. I mean, remember, those guys were outside of normal, way outside of normal, and they got there in a split second. What I can take away from this report and the other data is that there are still some very big questions they'll be looking at to answer. It now might take some months, but investigators do have ways of finding answers even with the missing 4 minutes of the CVR and FDR. 179 people lost their lives that morning, and I hope we can take lessons learned to prevent that from ever happening again. Thanks guys for watching. I really appreciate you all. Please support the channel by visiting sponsors and links below like Clemens Insurance. They've saved me a lot of money. If you need insurance, please check them out at clemensinsurance.net. You can also help us by watching some of our other videos like our in-depth report on the death of Ozzy Osbourne's guitar player Randy Rhoads in a plane crash. Remember, superior judgment trumps superior skill. Take care.